Well, we are in another theological conversation, this time with Dr. Matthew Bingham. He is a historian, is working more in the historical area, and he is going to help us to introduce us to his book, Orthodox Radicals. Hopefully, in near future, this book will be translated maybe in Spanish. But if not, I want to bring you to the Latin America speaking world this material in order that you can know this very important topic. But before we start, Dr. Matthew Bingham, can you give us something of yourself, maybe starting with the right pronouncing of your last name?
Well, thank you very much, Hector, and thank you so much for having me. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to talk with you and to talk and share with your audience a little bit about some of these topics. So pronunciation, Matthew Bingham, Bingham. So that's how I'd say it anyway. But you can say it in any way. That's fine. And I know what you mean. Yeah, a little bit about me. So I'm originally from the United States, from Los Angeles, California, and I'm married, and my wife's also from California. And we have 4 children who are ages 12 down to 1. So we got a good spread there. And we are, so I was a pastor in the United States of a Reformed Baptist church in the state of Georgia in the southeastern United States. And I went from there to the UK, United Kingdom, where I did my PhD in history and historical theology. And now I teach at a seminary theological college in London, in England, Oak Hill College. And I teach church history and systematic theology here in Oak Hill.
Which areas or topics of systematic theology?
Yeah, so I've had I've had opportunity to teach kind of a survey course, that sort of a doctrine survey here, and at the moment I'm also teaching a class on the doctrine of justification. So that's quite a good one. That's happening this semester, and we get into lots of important topics there about justification, how it relates to sanctification, some of the newer takes that people have had on Paul and what he really was trying to say. And so there's lots to talk about in that particular module.
Okay, great. We can start with our conversation now about your book. Why we were talking, we are going to follow the guide, but another question came to my mind, and why did you name the book Orthodox Radicals? We can start with that question, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, I think. So the title brings together 2 words that don't really go together, right? So when we're talking about radical, it comes from this Latin word radix for root. So if something's radical, it's something that goes all the way down to the roots of the thing and tries to upturn something maybe from the roots. So it's not a light change, it's not a superficial change, it's a radical change, it goes all the way down, right? And in the context of the 1600s, the 17th century in England, you have this period where a lot of what's been described as radical religious ideas start to come forward. So you have lots of people during the 1640s in England who are really proposing new ways of thinking about Christian theology, new ways about thinking about the church. And these ideas are described by historians as radical ideas because they're so, getting at the overturning serious things. And, you contrast that with a word like orthodox, where we're talking about the faith once for all delivered to the saints. We're talking about that which Christians ought to believe, that which Christians have held and taught and defended. And so those 2 words don't go together. So why have I put them together? Well, because the early Baptists, some of the first Baptists, the people who wrote the 1644 London Confession, for example, and some of those same people were in on the 1689 later Second London Confession. Those first English Calvinistic Baptists were people described, have been described as part of this radical religious upheaval. They were, and why? Well, because they were saying no to infant baptism, which was at the time seen as a very radical thing to do. And in a sense, it was a radical thing to do because, you know, all the historic branches of the Christian faith, whether Protestants or Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, they've all agreed. They might disagree on the reasons, but they've all agreed that you should baptize your babies. So here come these guys who say, no, actually, you shouldn't. The only people you should baptize are people who believe and profess faith. So that's a radical thing. But I've joined it with the word Orthodox to underscore and to make the point that these people who, yeah, in this one way were radical, they actually weren't all that radical in other ways. Actually, they were very much representing a mainstream, historic, reformed Christianity, a sort of Puritan way of being Christian, except for this one point, admittedly an important point, but just one point. So yes, they are radical as they're commonly regarded by most historians, but they're also in many ways orthodox. So trying to bring that together, bringing together two words that don't go together, trying to make us think and maybe rethink how we talk about these people.
Excellent, interesting. Before your explanation, I was taking that name as the Baptists are the most orthodox. Those that want to go to the last consequences of the Bible, but now I can understand it better. Your book is about the origins of the so-called particular Baptist, and your purpose is to trace and reveal their true identity. So maybe we can start to understand the book. What is the current state of the Baptist historiography that makes this necessary, that makes your book necessary? I believe it's necessary, but can you explain a little bit of that?
Yeah, thank you. So when we're talking about Baptist historiography, we're just talking about the history that has been written, the way historians have talked about this particular issue. And my contention is that historians have talked about this issue in ways that have been unhelpful. And not that everything they're saying is wrong, by no means, but there's some unhelpful things that have entered in. So what are those things? And namely, I'm trying to question when we talk about Baptists in the 1600s, when we talk about Baptists in the 17th century, and we use a big capital letter B, here are the Baptists, that suggests that there is this group of people going around who think of themselves as a group. They think of themselves as we are the Baptists. And though Baptists might disagree with other Baptists about certain issues, we're all Baptists together. And that's important to us. And that's how we identify. And the way the historiography has been written has sort of suggested this idea. It suggested you have this big group of Baptists going around, and they might disagree with each other over things, but they basically are on the same team. And typically, the way that Baptist group has been written about by historians is to think of them in terms of, okay, you got Baptists, and then you got two different kinds of Baptists. So Baptists come in two flavors. You mentioned particular Baptists and general Baptists. This is the way people talk. And particular Baptists are generally who we think of as the Calvinistic Baptists, and the general Baptists are the ones we would think of as Arminian Baptists. Particular and general referring to the extent of the atonement. Is the atonement limited or particular for the God's elect, or is the atonement general and made equally in the same way for all people? And that's how people talk about it. And if you pick up almost any book about Baptist history in the 17th century, you will find people talking about particular Baptists were doing this and general Baptists were doing that. But the problem with that is when you go and read the sources from the 17th century, the original documents, they don't talk about particular Baptists and they don't talk about general Baptists. They don't use those words. In fact, they don't use the word Baptist at all as a noun to describe people. They don't say, oh, we're the Baptists. They describe themselves in all sorts of ways, but they don't describe themselves that way. So noticing that was actually kind of what really started to puzzle me and trouble me and got me down the road to writing this book, Orthodox Radicals, because I'm trying to think, okay, well, what is this? What does it mean that they're not using these terms that we are so comfortable using? And might that show us something here that needs to be corrected?
Yes. Why this kind of historiography is so unanimous on that? How that happened that almost all the historians have the same idea?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think there's two kind of ways we might want to think about it. One way is just a phenomenon I think you get with lots of history writing. Namely, somebody is really interested in a subject. They go do some work, they write about it. Other people are also now interested in that subject or interested in other subjects that include that original subject. And what do? Well, they read this book that's been written and they read, oh, historian X here is really expert on this and he says this. So they kind of quote him and use his conclusions and maybe pick up some of his terminology, and then they go write that up in their own book. Then other people come along. Now you got two books using the same terminology. And little by little, this body of historical writing grows, this historiography develops. And it's very common, I think, for things to be repeated. People follow in, like wagon wheels in the dirt road, they get a little rut, and then you follow in the rut that was left by the guy who came in front of you. And that's what historians are doing too. And so that happens all the time. So I think in part, that's what we're seeing. But that still leaves open the question, how did this get going in the first place? And I think that really it goes back. There was a man named Thomas Crosby, who is widely regarded as the first Baptist historian. And Thomas Crosby, in the 18th century, in 1740, he publishes this book, The History of the English Baptists. And it's interesting because Crosby is a Baptist. He thinks of himself as a Baptist. And by 1740, you do have this denominational development. And when Crosby writes up the history of the earlier period, he basically says, look, and he says this in the book, he says, look, you have particular Baptists and you have general Baptists, but I'm not really concerned about those things. I just want to write about the Baptists, full stop. And so he presents this narrative about Baptists with a capital B and what they were doing. And my contention is, in so doing, he's actually projecting a lot on to the past. He's not just taking it direct, but he's filtering it through his own interpretive grid, his own lens, and that distorts it. And why is he doing that? Well, he had his own. He's not trying to be a villain or anything, but he has his own reasons. He sees himself. He's a churchman, and he has his own reasons for wanting to represent Baptist history in a certain way. And it's interesting, actually. For a long time, the people writing about Baptist history were so-called denominational historians, by which we mean not just that they were people who happened to be Baptists or Baptistic, and they also happened to be writing history. I mean, I think of myself as doing that. But we mean by denominational historian, we mean they're people who write openly and say, hey, I am writing about my own group here, and I am going to try to advance their cause. And they're very, they're very open about that. They're not trying to hide that. And so my thought is there's certain ways in which sometimes that kind of telling of the history can introduce distortions and problems.
Yes. So maybe these kind of historical denominational historians saw some things in the general Baptist and the particular Baptist, and they say, okay, ignore the difference, they are Baptist, and that help us for some cause, some argument, or for denomination or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's different thoughts we might have on that, but I think there is they had their own reasons for wanting, for some, thinking we want to tell our story and we want to represent the Baptist cause as important and significant. And it made sense to Crosby to kind of interpret Baptists as an overarching group. And eventually, as time goes by, more and more that becomes a thing, right? We have Baptist denominations, and we have all sorts of Baptist this and Baptist that. But the problem is when we look into the real early period, the 1640s, the 1650s, where these people are really emerging, we just don't find that same sense of denominational identity. And instead, we find a situation that is much more fluid, much more unformed.
Great. So we can see that the general Baptist and the particular Baptist didn't come from the same group. But what are then the origins of this group that we call particular Baptist? Men like Kiffen, like Knowles and Cox, where did they come from, and what was their background?
Yeah, it's great. So so essentially in the 1640s, you do get lots of people who are questioning pedobaptism, infant baptism. You get lots of people who are rejecting infant baptism. And my contention, though, is that is one theological controversy that people are thinking about. And just because you reject it doesn't mean we should draw a line around everybody who rejected it and say those are the Baptists with a big B. I think that confuses things. And so, but that's not to say that you didn't have Baptistic people rejecting infant baptism who were Calvinistic. And then you also had some people rejecting infant baptism who were more Arminian. And so, if we're talking about the Calvinistic Baptists, the people who signed the 1644 First London Confession of Faith, people, like William Kiffen, you mentioned, Hansard Knowles, others, where did they come from? So these people there's this particular independent church in London, the first independent church in London, a church started by Henry Jacob in the early 17th century. And this church carries on for some time as an independent church, meeting outside of the national church, the Church of England. And for a long time, it carries on. They have three pastors. They have a Henry Jacob, and then a gentleman named John Lothrop takes over. And then you get a third gentleman, Henry Jesse. And it's under the ministry of Henry Jesse in the late 1630s and into the 1640s, where all of a sudden people from this Jacob Lothrop Jesse church start to question infant baptism. And some of them form split off churches, some of them form their own churches, some of them remain in that church, but eventually you get this little cluster of people kind of gathered around London who are all sort of on the same page on this issue. And they've all decided, actually, we don't think infant baptism is taught in Scripture, and we need to get rid of that practice.
Yes, actually, I remember reading your book. some historical notes very important, like how they were able to debate the historical circumstances. So maybe you can help us a little bit with some of the historical background, because you say that all this started in this church, independent church. But can you help us to understand what is an independent church? Because for many people, maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense. So what were the historical circumstances in that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right, the term independent is in some ways a strange way to describe a church, because it immediately raises the question, independent from what? What are you independent from? So it's a relative term. And so when that word is used in the context of English church history in the 16th century, then the 17th century, we're talking about, and then the 17th century is really where you really start talking about this stuff. It means independent from, not connected to, the Church of England. So during the time we're talking about, you have the Church of England, which is a national church, meaning, it's funny, we hear the Church of England and we might think of it as one kind of, almost like one denomination among many. So you could be a Baptist, you could be a Methodist, you could be a Presbyterian, or you could be an Anglican, Church of England. But and that is kind of where things stand today. But in the early modern period, 16th century, 17th century, the Church of England was meant to be the church for all the English. So if you are English, if you are living in England, you are a part of the Church of England, whether you like it or not, because there's only one church on offer. And it's a church where the whole country is divided up into dioceses and parishes. And so anywhere you might live, wherever your little village might be, there's a Church of England church that is your parish church, and that's where you belong, and you're baptized into it. And so there's that tight connection between my membership in, as it were, in the nation, and my membership in the church, which goes with the nation. So when Henry Jacob comes along in the early 17th century and starts meeting and gathering Christians and say, hey, let's meet for worship. And you know what? We're not going to be in the parish church, the Church of England church. We're going to meet together outside of that context. That's quite a bold and illegal thing to do, as it were. And that's why that word independent that's where it's getting its meaning in the first instance, independent from the national church.
Yes, and a follow-up question about this. These guys were trying to do like church by their own, to say in that way, because they wanted to worship Christ in a more purely way. And maybe that helps us to understand the origins of the particular Baptist, because they were like Protestants and also Puritans. Can you help us to understand which things moved, for example, Lathrop to do this independent church? Because from there is going to come the particular Baptist. So maybe that helps us with the origins of the particular Baptist.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, really, I guess the story goes back even further. In the 16th century, at the start of the 16th century, all across Europe, including in England, where we're talking, you basically in the kind of Western European world, you have one church. You have the Roman Catholic Church, and you have the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and everybody is sort of under his control, a hierarchical church, power flowing from the Pope in Rome on down all the way through the bishops and all the way to the parish priests and all that. So the first thing that happens, of course, is you get the Protestant Reformation. And in English context, you have the King Henry VIII, breaking away from the Pope and starting his own church, the Church of England, to be independent. So we want to talk about independent is a relative term. That's an independency right there, right? We're independent from the Pope. So now you have Church of England, independent from Rome, doing its own thing. Okay, now the question becomes, what kind of church is the Church of England? And really, right from the beginning, that was a question that was debated and contested and fought over and argued over. Not everybody in England agreed on what the Church of England should look like. And some people in the Church of England wanted it to be more like Roman Catholicism, just without the Pope. Other people wanted it to be much more like the Swiss Reformed churches associated with people like Zwingli and John Calvin and Heinrich Bullinger and people like that. So you have people who really want it to look more like Roman Catholicism, keep more of the Roman Catholic elements. You have some people who want it to be just like John Calvin's Geneva. And then you have some people who are sort of in between. But basically, you have all this disagreement. And so essentially, this Puritan movement, which arises in England under Queen Elizabeth in the latter half of the 16th century, these Puritans are people who basically think that the Church of England contains too many holdovers, too many leftovers from Roman Catholicism, and we need to get rid of those and purify the church, as it were. That's a sort of rough and ready understanding of what these Puritans were about. And somebody like Henry Jacob, these are people who, again, are very much in that line of thought. They're looking at the Church of England and they're saying, hey, we're not happy with this. There's too much Roman Catholicism here. And they had a whole host of things that they didn't like. But for someone like Henry Jacob, what made him different than a lot of the Puritans was he actually said, you know what? It's not just that the Church of England has a few, ceremonies we don't like. They didn't like some of the things that were in the Book of Common Prayer, which was the worship book for the Church of England. It's not just that we object to this little thing or that little thing. Henry Jacob says, actually, you know what? The problem is this whole hierarchical structure, this Episcopalian structure, this thing where you have bishops and they're above the lower ministers and telling them what to do, and it's all interconnected, that actually isn't biblical. And Henry Jacob says the only kind of institutional church, he would call it political church, just by which he just means the only sort of institutional body that the New Testament recognizes is the local congregation. And so your local congregation might work with another local congregation and you might team up and whatever, but the only entity that the New Testament knows when it talks about visible churches are local congregations with elders and deacons. So they have their officers, but beyond the local church, you don't have any overarching structure to regulate and control and dictate and tell local churches what to do. That's Henry Jacob's insight. So in other words, he's not just saying, hey, the Church of England has problems and needs to be reformed or changed. He's saying actually the whole idea of the Church of England is a problem because it's out of step with the New Testament. So while he would have had lots of issues and complaints about the Church of England, the biggest one, the most significant one, the one that made him independent in the sense we were talking about it, is this total rejection of the very idea of a national hierarchical Episcopalian church.
Thank you. How the Baptistic insights became more clear in this group that we now call particular Baptist, which external circumstances produced this relationship, because you explain in your book that from this Jacob Lathrop Jesse congregation, some Baptistic emphasis became with the time more evident. Can you tell our audience something about that? And also how the 1644 confession, the Baptist 1644 confession, helped also that unity, that group, unify that group, maybe.
Yeah. So in terms of, this question of how so you have this Jacob Lathrop Jesse church, independent church. How do they become Baptistic? How do they start rejecting paedobaptism? Why do they go down that road? And that's a really good question. And you can answer it on a number of different levels. On a most basic level, interestingly, for some people in the church, they really started thinking about this question when they found themselves with a baby. So there's multiple stories from this period about husband and wife are going to have a baby, and all of a sudden, in a way they hadn't thought before, they're thinking, "Oh, should we baptize this baby?" And what do we do? And that prompts them to think about this question. But that's actually to move too far forward, because why does it start to occur to people that there might even be a problem with baptizing your baby? Nobody was worried about baptizing their baby for a long time. Everybody thought, of course, you baptize your baby. That's what you do. All of a sudden, late 1630s, 1640s, you start getting this question mark in the minds of many. Should we baptize babies? Where does that come from? And this is one of those things where we talked about the historiography, the way that this story has been written by historians. And what I've found is that almost all of the kind of mainstream academic historical scholarship on this question, almost all of it kind of just treats it as a matter of, well, these people were biblicists. They were very interested in the Bible, and they looked in their Bible and they looked in their New Testament, and they didn't see any examples of babies being baptized, and they didn't hear Paul giving a command to baptize babies. So they just said, well, I guess we can't do this anymore. Now that's interesting, because on the one hand, that's surely true, right? That obviously these people care deeply about the Bible and they want to follow the Bible. And so they are, of course, saying this isn't in the New Testament and we don't see any examples of it and we don't hear any commands to do it. So we're not going to do it. So that's obviously true. But is that the whole story? And I have questions about that, because for one, these people that we're talking about, they weren't the only people who loved the Bible and wanted to follow the Bible. Lots of people during this period were wanting to follow the Bible wherever it led them. And they'd been wanting to follow the Bible for a long time. And yet it's only in this certain period, this late 1630s, early 1640s, that people start going in this Baptist direction. So it feels to me like, okay, there must be something more happening that can help us explain why this change is happening, because surely people for a long time were aware that there aren't explicit examples or commands to baptize babies in the New Testament. So, we want to dig deeper. Can we say more? And, for me, I was struck by the fact that the people who become Baptists, become Baptistic during this period, they're almost all, not entirely all, but they're almost all coming from independent or congregational, and I'm just using congregational here as more or less to mean independent. They're coming from this independent congregational context. You don't see as many people coming from other contexts. And so I got interested in this idea that actually, that feels to me like a very important context. And you start noticing that the move toward independent or congregational ecclesiology, the move toward saying the only institutional church the New Testament recognizes is the local congregation, that move comes first. And then after people have made that shift, you start seeing some of those same people begin to question infant baptism. And I think that there is a logic to that. I think that the logic of infant baptism does not fit as well and as comfortably with a congregational ecclesiology. Why would that be? Well, congregational ecclesiology puts emphasis on the church as a body of believers who are gathering together and are covenanting together, are joining together, have a shared common profession of faith, and they're all believers. And that contrasts rather sharply with a national church where everybody in the particular geographic area is a member of the church by default, because this is where you happen to live. So, you're sort of born into it, as it were, almost. That seems to fit with infant baptism very tightly and nicely. That has parallels with sort of Old Testament Israel, where the people and the church and the nation and the church and the sign of the covenant and all, they're all coterminous. They all go together. So all the boys, the little boys are circumcised, not because they make a profession of faith, but because they're born into Israel. And so I think that what ends up happening is, as people move away from a national church ecclesiology, it's not that necessitates that they reject infant baptism. Many didn't, most did not, most kept infant baptism, but I do think it unsettles people. And I think all of a sudden you have a new ecclesiological context where the practice of paedobaptism just doesn't make as much sense. To be a member of a congregational church, you have to join on profession of faith, and you have to make a credible profession of faith. And people, obviously we can't know the soul, but I have to hear you, and you have to say you believe in Christ and you've repented and trusted. And, I have to say, yeah, I accept you as a brother in Christ, and now you're a member. And that logic of congregational membership based on profession of faith, it just doesn't, it seems to sit at odds with this alternative route into the church. So you either have to make a credible profession of faith, or you can be born to a Christian parent and then you're baptized that way. And then you're somehow brought into the church. Those two things feel at odds. And I think congregational polity, as it emerges during this period, and the practice of paedobaptism is just an unstable mixture for a lot of people. And so you start to see this new thing emerging.
Very interesting. Yeah, so are you saying that this kind of congregational way made many people to think about that practice of infant baptism and ask if that was a valid way to do church? So very interesting. Maybe in order to help people to understand better this identity of these 17 Calvinistic, Baptistic, Congregationalist guys, imagining that we are in the 17th century, if you ask, for example, Kiffen or Knowles, are you a particular Baptist? Are you a Reformed Baptist? What would his response will be, and why? I listened I listened to you in a podcast, maybe the London Lyceum, maybe, I don't know. And you answered this question like very clearly, like distinguishing between the right now and the historical work. So can you help us answering that question?
Yeah. Well, it's a fun way to put it. What if you went back to, say, you went back to 1644, and there are these people forming, and you asked them, oh, what are you? So if you go all the way back to 1644, these guys, they didn't know what to call themselves. They could not settle on any consistent self-identifier. They would identify themselves in different ways. Often they identified themselves negatively. They would say that we're not Anabaptists. We can talk about that in a minute, but to just get more direct to your question, we can circle back if you want. But, if you asked them, are you a Reformed Baptist? I think they would have given you a real funny look, because Reformed Baptist was not a term that anybody was using at all. And that is a label that has come around in later centuries. Things I've read, people suggest that was more of a 20th century coinage. And again, I think it's a helpful one But we need to be clear that it wasn't a term that was being used in the 17th century, to be sure. They also weren't calling themselves particular Baptists. And with that one, it is interesting. You do start to get in the latter half of the 17th century, you start to see every once in a while a reference connecting particular with a Calvinistic kind of Baptist. But the interesting thing is, it's not the Baptists themselves describing in that way. It's other people. So, for example, there are Quakers, another religious group emerging during this time, and Quaker polemicists sometimes will talk about Baptists and describe them in some of these ways. But the people signing the Confession of Faith were not using any of these terms. And so, again, how did they describe? Well, most of the time they just talked about themselves as we're a Church of Christ. We're Christians, and again, this gets back to, I guess, Orthodox radicals. They certainly didn't see themselves as doing anything that wasn't Orthodox, down the line, historic Christianity, except for this very significant point on baptism. But yeah, they'd regard themselves as Christians, Church of Christ. Sometimes as time goes by, more and more, they start to say things like we're baptized churches. So that sounds more like Baptist churches, baptized versus Baptist. So you do start to see that. Sometimes you'll see, that language. So they had different ways of doing it. But what I find interesting is that all during this kind of mid 17th century period where they're emerging and coming into being, they don't have any consistent way of self-describing.
Yes, we jump the question about in any way the 1644 confession helped the unification of these Baptistic guys groups. I made a mistake to jump, but can you say something about that, or it wasn't a issue?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the 1644 confession is an important moment for the people that we're talking about. It is a group of 7 churches coming together to basically put their names to a confession of faith, a statement of faith. Here's what we believe. And it's interesting, the circumstances behind it. We know it appears. We know that they were handing out copies outside of Parliament to try to get people to read this. The question is raised, why were they doing this? What was this about? And, I think that it seems clear that they are putting this out as sort of a almost a piece of I don't know what we'd call it, like an advertisement, promotional literature, that they're trying to get the word out about who they are, because people have all these bad ideas about them. I mentioned that their confession talks about them, and they don't know how to describe themselves. And one of the ways they describe themselves is to say, we're not Anabaptists. And that's really interesting. What is that about? That's weird. So Anabaptist, the word comes out of the 16th century, the century before, on the continent in Europe, where you have people coming along who are also saying no to infant baptism. And the word Anabaptist means re-baptizer, one who baptizes again, because if you're a paedo-baptist, then the idea is you've already been baptized once when you're a baby, and now these people come along and they want to baptize you a second time. Now, of course, anyone who's taking a credo-baptist position would say, hey, this is not a second baptism. Actually, this is a first baptism. The first thing, whatever happened to you when you were a baby, it wasn't what the New Testament recognizes as baptism. So we're going to baptize you for the first time. That's the argument back and forth, of course. In any event, so these Anabaptists in the 16th century in Europe had a bad reputation, not totally undeserved. There were some people who did some very strange things, who also happened to reject paedo-baptism, among other things, and they were all labeled Anabaptists. But the point is, people lumped all these folks together and used it as a kind of insult. And essentially, you know, to say, oh, you guys are Anabaptists, we know you're the crazy people who, you know, you throw out good doctrine, you're unruly, you're a threat to church and state, essentially. So these English Calvinistic 1644 Baptistic people are really trying to distance themselves from these Anabaptists and say, actually, you know, we believe basically the same thing that you all believe. We just disagree on this particular point. And that again gets at the kind of Orthodox radicals idea. So they're putting this out, trying to get an audience, trying to gain a hearing with the, you know, the Westminster Assembly is happening in this time, and they are trying to make themselves known and to say, we're not people to be feared. We're not a threat. We're not heterodox. We're not preaching heresy. We actually are kind of, you know, sort of mainstream Reformed Puritan type guys, but we do disagree on this point on baptism.
Yes, and what does it mean that those Baptists can be better identified as Congregationalist? What did it mean to be a Congregationalist at that time? And this question is important because here in the Latin America world, we have we can say maybe a revival or something of Reformed theology. We have like all this started some years ago with some important preachers of the US, and people began to like understand their false conversion and things like that. And now I see, this is my interpretation, is not the reality maybe, but it's my interpretation of the reality. And right now, Reformed theology is like digging, like being very spreading very fast in Latin America, and it's not primarily by the Presbyterians in this time. You know, in the 17th century, maybe was the strong group was the Presbyterian, and Baptists were like the short groups. But now I think that the Reformed theology is more advanced here by the Baptist, Reformed Baptist. But before I read your book and some things that happen in our lives as a church, I was like interpreting the church government of the church more like a middle way between Presbyterian and Congregationalist. But now I see that actually the Baptists were Congregationalists. So what does that mean? What are the implications even of these things for our lives as Reformed churches, that we are, like, our church is a confessional church. We hold the 1689 or the 1677. But yes, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great it's a great point, because and in a sense, so you reference these Congregationalists, and you know, we can use that in different ways. In the 17th century, when you get churches like the Jacob Lothrop Jesse Church, which we talked about as an independent church, independent from the Church of England, recognizing only the local congregation as the New Testament model for us. This idea grows and it gains momentum amongst English people, and indeed it gains special momentum amongst Puritan people in England who leave Old England and end up in New England in North America and set up churches in North America. And as it gains steam, it increasingly comes under the label Congregationalism or the Congregational Way. That was a way they talked about, the Congregational Way. Sometimes they'll even talk about it as the New England Way, you know, with reference to the fact that the New England Puritans are all interested in this particular way of doing the church. And so you have these terms around independent, congregational, meaning more or less the same thing. And again, this is a point about ecclesiology, about the doctrine of the church, about how the church is to be organized and run. And so what happens then when you have certain people from within that group questioning infant baptism and becoming Baptistic, they don't cease to be congregational in their approach to ecclesiology. In fact, I think they see credo baptism, believers' baptism, as actually a more consistent approach to baptism in light of their congregationalist ecclesiology. And so part of the reason in the book I call them Baptistic Congregationalists, to try to highlight that connection and to say that actually, you know, this is one of the problems when we label these people Baptists with a capital B, and we use that in a kind of loose way, in a kind of unthinking way, we sort of obscure or hide the connections here. So what, you know, we can call ourselves Reformed Baptists today, and I don't have any issue with that term, and the church where I was pastor we would call ourselves a Reformed Baptist church, and I think that's great. But we need to also recognize that the polity, the ecclesiology that underlies something like the 1689 London Confession is a congregational polity, and the Baptist part, the Baptistic part, the credo baptism part, is how we understand our sacramentology, how we approach the sacrament, the ordinance of baptism. So those things are related, but they are distinct from one another. And so we can, you know, if we're Reformed Baptists, we are people who hold to congregational polity, congregational ecclesiology, and we're credo Baptist with respect to who is and who is not a valid recipient of baptism.
Yes, actually, Sam Bingham wrote a preface for a new edition of the 1689 Confession in Spanish. He said in the preface or introduction that actually the particular Baptists were not like very Baptist in some way because the church government was taken from the Congregationalists. So can you tell us a little bit of how does the congregational way look in practice? How was this kind of government in the church?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I suspect that, you know, one of the points that is helpful to bring out is sometimes when we think of Baptist churches, we think of churches that are totally on their own, totally isolated, totally disconnected from other churches, and sometimes we think of it as, well, that's sort of the essence of what we're about, the independence of the local church. And of course there's a sense in which that's true. But if we look back to these 17th century Congregationalists, this congregational way, one of the things that comes out is, yes, they are identifying the local church, the local congregation, as the only New Testament church. But one thing that they thought was very important that maybe we don't always see is they saw a need for, just because your local church is not subordinate to or under the rule and direction of another church or another church body, that doesn't mean you should not have close, tight connections with other churches. There's a term that when they were talking about this, that they would use these two terms to differentiate themselves from Presbyterians, and they would say, we believe in consociation. I don't know how this will go for the translation, but we believe in consociation without subordination. So in other words, you know, we can use the word association, makes the same, you know, same basic meaning, I think. They're saying, look, we believe churches should be associated together. They should be connected. They should be linking arms together for the better support of each other and the preaching of the gospel. But we don't believe in subordination. We don't believe that there's a hierarchy here, where local churches have to be told what to do and controlled in some significant way by something outside of and above the local church. And these 17th century Congregationalists seem to almost take for granted that that was a good thing. Now, how that looks in practice can be very tricky, and it was tricky for them, and it's tricky for us today. But certainly the need for some kind of working together in some kind of formal way was something that you see in the 1644 Confession. You see it in the 1689. You see it in all the different writings on congregationalism and ecclesiology that are being put forward, and it's very significant. And for our purposes, it's important to see that they certainly did not see local churches linking up and supporting each other in all sorts of sort of, in some ways, formal ways. They didn't see that connection as violating their congregationalist ecclesiology. In fact, they saw it as an expression of it.
Yeah, actually, they needed a lot because they were not supported by the state, and they need to join hands to do great things. Maybe the last question for this video is, when we talk about congregationalism, maybe it brings the idea of democracy or something like that. Are we talking about that kind of church government where the members control absolutely the way the church goes, and also where there is no authority of the pastors or leaders? Are you saying something like that with congregationalist?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think in some ways, like the question, like what we were talking about a minute ago with, okay, we want to have some kind of association. We want to be linking arms with other local congregations. We can agree on that in principle, and those people who went before certainly did. But then sometimes it would be tricky in practice, and how it plays out in terms of how those details work themselves out can be tricky, and people might give different answers at different points. But on this one, I think, it seems to be something similar. So if we're talking about these 17th century people, Congregationalists, Baptistic or otherwise, they certainly would not have held to some kind of pure democracy in every respect. They had officers, there's elders in place, and they have responsibilities before the Lord to shepherd the flock of God. And that, means that they're going to have to take real leadership and do certain things, and can't be putting every single thing up to a vote by all the members. But once we say, okay, well, the elders have to do some things on their own initiative and on their own accord, so that they can actually lead and actually shepherd the flock of God, and we want to invest them with authority, and we want to respect that authority. Where do you draw the line? Because you're also going to want to affirm that the kind of I've heard it put, the sort of final backstop, as it were, the final authority rests ultimately with the congregation itself. So there's a sense in which the elders are acting to lead the church, but there's always that interplay. So when do you call for a congregational vote, and when do you just let the elders kind of get on with it? I think that's a question that, admits some variation and play. I think that's the case in our day, as we try to build churches that honor some of these New Testament principles and ideas. And I think you see some of that same variation amongst 17th century voices, where you would see people trying to wrestle with what these things look like in practice, and on a sort of fine-grained level, you might see different approaches. But I think the overarching point would be, you can affirm church officers, you can affirm elders and say they have a legitimate role and a legitimate authority, while also maintaining that the final authority rests with the congregation as a whole, the members of the church.
Well, thank you for this. If you want to add something, you have the last word. If not, we are finished with this conversation.
Yeah, I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me, and I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk and to think about some of these things together, and wish every blessing to you in your ministry.